Imagine a war so vast that mountains were torn from their roots and hurled like stones. A conflict so violent that the earth cracked open and the seas boiled. A struggle so cosmic that the very fabric of reality trembled, uncertain whether it would survive. This was not a war between nations, not a clash of armies over territory or treasure. This was a war between generations of gods, between the old order and the new, between those who had ruled since the dawn of creation and those who would not be ruled at all. The Greeks called it the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. And when it ended after 10 brutal years, nothing would ever be the same. The universe itself would be remade. But what most people forget when they hear of Zeus's glorious victory is that wars are not simply won by the righteous. They are won by those willing to do whatever it takes. And before the Olympians could claim their thrones, they would have to descend into depths of violence that would haunt them forever. The seeds of this war were planted in darkness. In the belly of Cronus, to be precise, where 5 young gods waited in impossible imprisonment. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, swallowed at birth by their own father, condemned to exist in that pulsing darkness for eons untold. They were not dead, for gods cannot truly die, but they were not alive in any meaningful sense either. They were suspended, waiting, feeling the slow centuries pass through the walls of their living prison. And then, one day, everything changed. Light flooded their darkness. Air rushed into lungs that had never properly breathed, and they found themselves standing in the light of the world for the first time, looking upon a young god with eyes like storm clouds and lightning already flickering at his fingertips. Zeus, their youngest brother, the one who had escaped their father's hunger, had come to set them free. But freedom, they would quickly learn, came with a price. Freedom meant war. The Titans were not simply going to surrender their dominion over the cosmos. They had ruled since the beginning of ordered existence. They had shaped the world, named the stars, established the very laws of nature. Cronus sat upon his throne with the weight of ages behind him, surrounded by his brothers and sisters. Oceanus, the world-encircling river. Hyperion, the blazing light. Coeus and Crius, lords of intellect and the constellations. Iapetus, father of Prometheus and Atlas, and the great Titanesses who had borne the structure of reality itself. These were beings of primordial power, children of earth and sky, ancient beyond human comprehension. Against them stood 6 young gods, newly born into consciousness, untested in combat, possessing nothing but their rage and their determination. On the surface, it seemed an impossible contest. The old order entrenched and mighty. The new generation outnumbered and outmatched. But the young gods had something the Titans did not. They had nothing to lose, and they had everything to prove. The war began in Thessaly, in the shadow of Mount Othrys, where the Titans had established their fortress. The Olympians, as they would come to be called, made their stand on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in all of Greece, its summit often hidden by clouds that seemed, even then, to carry the promise of thunder. Between these 2 mountains, across the fertile plains and rocky valleys of the mortal world, the first battles were fought. And immediately it became clear that this would not be a quick campaign. The Titans were too powerful, too numerous, too deeply rooted in the very substance of creation. Cronus himself led his forces with the terrible efficiency of a being who had overthrown his own father. He knew how succession worked. He knew what the young gods wanted, and he was determined to deny them at any cost. For 10 years the war raged without resolution, 10 years of combat that mortal minds can barely comprehend. When gods fight, they do not simply swing swords and shoot arrows. They hurl the fundamental forces of nature at each other. Hyperion turned the very sunlight into a weapon, blazing down upon the Olympians with heat that could melt bronze and crack stone. Oceanus sent his countless river children to flood the valleys where Zeus's forces camped, drowning the nymphs and minor spirits who had allied with the new order. Creus summoned the cold fire of the distant stars, raining celestial destruction upon Olympus itself. And Cronus fought with the adamantine sickle that had unmade his own father, that terrible curved blade still carrying echoes of the violence that had birthed the current age. Against this onslaught, the young gods struggled to hold their ground. Zeus could summon storms, but his mastery of the thunderbolt was still incomplete. Poseidon could shake the earth, but he had not yet learned to make it truly obey him. Hades could touch the power of the underworld, but that realm had no true ruler yet, and its forces were scattered and wild. They were learning to be gods even as they fought for the right to exist at all. The turning point came not through martial prowess, but through wisdom. Perhaps it was Gaia who whispered the secret to Zeus. Perhaps it was Prometheus, that strange titan who had allied himself with the Olympians, seeing in Zeus a future he wished to be part of. Perhaps Zeus simply remembered the old stories, the tales his mother Rhea had told him in that hidden cave on Crete. Whatever the source, the knowledge was this: beneath the earth, in the deepest pit of Tartarus, 3 beings of unimaginable power remained imprisoned. The Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, thunder, lightning, and brightness given form, and the 100-handed ones, Cottus, Briareos, and Gyges, monsters of impossible anatomy, each possessing 50 heads and 100 arms. Uranus had first imprisoned them, horrified by their appearance. Cronus had kept them chained, unwilling to release forces he could not control. For eons they had languished in darkness, forgotten by the world above. But they had not forgotten their hatred for those who had imprisoned them, and they had not forgotten how to fight. Zeus descended into Tartarus. This was not a journey made lightly. Tartarus lay beneath even the underworld, a realm of absolute darkness where the air itself seemed to press against the spirit with malevolent weight. It was said that a bronze anvil dropped from heaven would fall for 9 days before striking earth, and then 9 more days before reaching Tartarus. The young god passed through horrors that would later haunt his dreams, shapeless things that predated form, hungers that had no names, the discarded failures of creation's earliest experiments. And at the bottom, chained with bonds that Cronus himself had forged, he found them. The Cyclopes raised their single great eyes, red-rimmed from ages of darkness, and looked upon this stranger who had dared to seek them out. The 100-handed ones stirred their countless limbs, sending avalanches of dust through the endless cavern. "Who are you?" they asked with voices like grinding stone. "And why should we not crush you where you stand?" Zeus spoke. He told them of the war raging above, of Cronus, who had kept them imprisoned when he could have freed them, of the new order that was fighting to be born. And he made them a promise that he alone among all who had ever held power would actually keep. "Fight with me," he said, "and when we win, you will be free. Not just released, but honored. You will have a place in the world we build. You will be repaid for every moment you have suffered in this pit." The Cyclopes considered. Brontes, whose name meant thunder, looked at Zeus and saw something in the young god's eyes. A kinship, perhaps. An affinity for the storm that he himself embodied. "We will forge you weapons," he said at last. "Weapons worthy of a king." And they did. In the depths of Tartarus, with forges that burned with the heat of the earth's core, the Cyclopes created 3 artifacts of absolute power. For Zeus, they made the thunderbolt, not merely lightning, but the very wrath of heaven given physical form. For Poseidon, the Trident, a three-pronged spear that could command the seas and shake the foundations of the world. For Hades, the helm of invisibility, darkness made solid, allowing its wearer to pass unseen even among gods. The hundred-handed ones made no weapons. They needed none. When they emerged from Tartarus, following Zeus up through cracks in the earth that groaned at their passage, they carried only what they had always possessed. 300 arms among them, capable of hurling boulders the size of houses, of grasping enemies in unbreakable holds, of fighting on 50 fronts simultaneously. They stepped onto the surface of the world for the first time in eons, and even the Titans felt a tremor of fear. Not because the hundred-handed ones were necessarily more powerful than any single Titan, but because they were unexpected, because they were angry, because they represented the return of everything Cronus had tried to bury. The final battle was joined on the plains between Othrys and Olympus. Every Titan who would fight assembled under Cronus's banner, all except Oceanus, who had stayed neutral throughout the war, and Themis, Mnemosyne, and some of the other Titanesses who had seen which way the wind was blowing. Against them stood the 6 Olympians, now armed with weapons of terrible power. Behind them ranged the hundred-handed ones, already gathering boulders from the surrounding mountains. And in the shadows waited allies whose allegiance would prove crucial. Prometheus the Forethought, Hecate the witch goddess, the river Styx who had sworn her waters to Zeus's cause. The battle began at dawn and would not end until the world was nearly unmade. Zeus fought as he had never fought before. The thunderbolts sang in his hand, blazing across the battlefield with strokes that shattered Titan armor and burned through divine flesh. Each throw returned to his grasp as if magnetized, hungry for more. He targeted Cronus again and again, but the old king was crafty, experienced, and the adamantine sickle turned aside even the lightning of heaven. They dueled across miles of churning earth, their conflict tearing valleys into existence, throwing up mountains where none had stood before. Meanwhile, Poseidon waded through the Titan lines with his trident, each strike sending shockwaves that toppled warriors like wheat before a scythe. The seas themselves rose at his call. Inland though they were, great walls of salt water crashing down upon the enemy with crushing force. Hades moved unseen through the chaos, the helm of invisibility making him a ghost on the battlefield. He struck at the most vulnerable moments, appearing behind Titans who thought themselves protected, his sword finding joints in armor, gaps in defense. No one could guard against an enemy they could not see, but it was the hundred-handed ones who truly turned the tide. Cottus, Briareos, and Gyges stationed themselves behind the Olympian lines, and from there they unleashed a bombardment of such ferocity that the Titans could not advance. Each of their 100 arms hurled a boulder simultaneously, creating walls of flying stone that darkened the sky. Mountains were stripped to their cores to feed their ammunition. The ground shook not from earthquakes, but from the constant impact of their projectiles. The Titans, for all their power, could not push through that relentless barrage. They were forced back, step by step, toward Mount Othrys, and as they retreated, their unity began to fracture. Some Titans fell in combat. Others fled when they saw the tide turning. Still others threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. But Cronus would not surrender. Even as his brothers were cast down around him, even as his children pressed closer with their terrible weapons gleaming, he fought on, the father battling his children, the old king refusing to release his grip on a throne that was already slipping away. The end came not with a single decisive blow, but with an accumulation of defeats. Cronus was surrounded, finally, by all 6 of his children. The very gods he had swallowed now returned to exact their vengeance. Zeus held the thunderbolt ready. Poseidon's trident dripped with the ichor of fallen titans. Hades removed his helm, becoming visible, so that Cronus could see all of them together. His children, his would-be victims, his conquerors. What passed between them in that moment, no poet ever recorded. Perhaps there were no words. Perhaps there was only the recognition of cycles ending and beginning, of prophecies fulfilled, of a father looking upon the faces he had once condemned to darkness, and knowing that his darkness had found him instead. The Titans were bound with unbreakable chains and cast into Tartarus, the same prison where they had left the Cyclopes and Hundred-Handed Ones to suffer for eons. The Hundred-Handed Ones themselves became the wardens of that prison, guarding the gates eternally, ensuring that the old order would never rise again. There was a certain poetry in this arrangement. Those who had been imprisoned became the imprisoners. Those who had suffered in darkness now controlled the darkness. But not all Titans were punished equally. Atlas, who had led the Titan forces in many of their campaigns, received a sentence that would become legendary. He was condemned to stand at the western edge of the world, holding the sky upon his shoulders for all eternity, forever bearing the weight that Uranus had once been. Prometheus, who had sided with the Olympians, was rewarded with freedom, for now. His punishment would come later, when his gift of fire to mortals would anger Zeus and begin a new cycle of divine retribution. Epimetheus, his foolish brother, was similarly spared. The Titanesses who had not fought were largely left in peace, their roles in the cosmic order too important to disrupt. Oceanus continued to encircle the world. Mnemosyne retained her dominion over memory. Themis remained the embodiment of divine law. The world needed continuity even amid revolution. And what of Cronus himself? The accounts diverge here, as if even the ancient poets could not agree on the fate of the father who had devoured his children. Some say he was bound in Tartarus with the others, his once magnificent form weighed down by chains of adamantine, his voice silenced by the crushing pressure of the depths. Others tell a stranger tale, that Zeus eventually relented, that time softened even his justified anger, that Cronus was released to rule over the islands of the blessed, a distant paradise where the virtuous dead lived in eternal peace. Perhaps both accounts are true in their way. Perhaps Cronus did suffer in Tartarus but was eventually paroled, his sentence commuted by a son who understood that vengeance has limits. The Greeks themselves seemed uncertain, and perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. Justice for crimes on a cosmic scale cannot be simple. Even the gods struggled to determine what was fair. The Titanomachy ended, and a new age began. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades divided the cosmos by lot. Zeus drew the sky, becoming the king of gods and men, his throne established on the peak of Mount Olympus, where clouds gathered at his feet and eagles circled in eternal attendance. Poseidon drew the seas, claiming dominion over every ocean, every river that flowed to the sea, every creature that swam beneath the waves. Hades drew the underworld, the realm of the dead, a kingdom without sunlight but not without its own dark grandeur. The earth itself was left as common ground, a meeting place for all three brothers and for the mortals who would soon proliferate across its surface. The sisters took their places in this new order as well. Hestia became the goddess of the hearth, the sacred fire at the center of every home. Demeter claimed agriculture, the growth of crops, the fertility that sustains life. Hera, in time, would become Zeus's queen, goddess of marriage and family. The Olympians were established. The new order was born. But here is what we must understand about the Titanomachy and its aftermath. This was not simply good defeating evil. The Greeks were never naive enough to frame their myths in such simple terms. The Titans were not villains, not in the way we might think of villains today. They were the old order, powerful, ancient, and perhaps out of step with the cosmos's needs, but not wicked in their essence. Hyperion had given the world the sun. Oceanus had provided the waters upon which life depended. Prometheus, a Titan himself, would go on to become humanity's greatest benefactor. To cast all Titans as monsters is to miss the point entirely. What the Titanomachy represented was not the triumph of good over evil, but the necessary violence of change. The old must give way to the new. Those who cling to power must eventually lose it. The children will always rise to replace the parents, whether in individual families or in the cosmic order itself. Consider, too, the cost of the Olympians' victory. 10 years of warfare that scarred the earth itself. Mountains moved, valleys drowned, forests burned. The mortal world, such as it was in those early days, was devastated by divine conflict. And when it was over, the victors faced a troubling realization. They had won through violence, and violence had become normalized in the cosmos. Zeus would rule not purely through justice, but through the memory of thunderbolts. Poseidon would command obedience with the threat of earthquakes and floods. The Olympians were better than the Titans in many ways, but they were not innocent. They had won a war, and war leaves no one unchanged. Perhaps this explains some of the Olympians' later behavior, their quarrels, their cruelties, their petty rivalries. Having achieved power through cosmic violence, they struggled to maintain it through anything else. The Titanomachy also established a pattern that would echo through all subsequent Greek mythology, the pattern of succession through violence. Uranus was overthrown by Cronus. Cronus was overthrown by Zeus. The question that haunted Olympus ever after was obvious. Who would overthrow Zeus? The king of gods spent much of his reign trying to prevent any prophecy that might suggest such an outcome. He swallowed his first wife Metis when he learned that her children might surpass him. He bound Prometheus partly because the Titan knew a secret about Zeus's eventual downfall. He was suspicious of any god or mortal who grew too powerful, too popular, too capable of challenging his supremacy. In this, Zeus was not so different from his father. The throne changed hands, but the fear of losing it remained the same. And yet there is something different about the age of the Olympians. Something that the Titans, for all their power, never achieved. The Olympians shared power. Not perfectly, not without conflict, but they shared it nonetheless. Zeus ruled the sky, but he did not rule alone. He had his council, his family, his complex web of relationships with other gods. The Olympian age saw the establishment of divine spheres of influence, each god claiming certain domains, certain responsibilities, certain forms of worship. It was messy and contentious and frequently disrupted by jealousy or rage, but it was also more dynamic, more generative than the frozen perfection of Cronus's rule. The Golden Age had been beautiful, but it had also been static. Nothing changed, nothing grew, nothing evolved. The Olympian age was turbulent, but it was alive. What, then, can we learn from this ancient war? Perhaps this: that change is inevitable, but how we handle that change defines us. Cronus fought against the future and was destroyed by it. The Olympians embraced their moment and seized it, even knowing that they too might someday face their own successors. To be alive is to be part of an ongoing story, one where we are neither the first chapter nor the last. The Titans are gone now, sleeping in the depths of Tartarus or scattered to the corners of existence. But their blood runs in every Olympian vein. Their power underlies the world we still inhabit. And somewhere, perhaps, in the deepest pit of the cosmos, Cronus still waits, still watches, still wonders if the cycle might turn once more. The war is over. The thunder has faded from the slopes of Othrys. The great boulders hurled by 100 hands have settled into the new geography of a wounded Earth. And on the peak of Mount Olympus, wrapped in clouds that smell of lightning and possibility, a new king sits upon a new throne. Zeus looks out over the world his victory has created, and he knows, perhaps better than anyone, that no victory is final. No throne is eternal. But for now, in this moment, the sky belongs to him. And somewhere far below, in a darkness that has no bottom, the old gods dream of ages past. The war between generations is over. The war for the soul of the cosmos has only just begun.